everyone. My name is Rochelle Innocent and I'm the founder and CEO of Project Purpose. Welcome to our channel. Our community is focused on fostering the intellectual and character development in children. We do this through our parent-child workshops that are focused on 4 themes: autonomy, self-efficacy, compassion, and self-concept, in order to cultivate grit, perseverance, and resilience in each child. And we are so thrilled to be offering one of the first of its kind digital, virtual, and continuous learning environments, enabling parents and children to connect from all around the world. At Project Purpose, our overarching mandate is to renew and rebuild family, community, and relationships. Our different social media platforms provide us with an opportunity to have discussions and to create space for all topics that relate to family, community, and relationships with ourselves as well as with others, with a primary focus on mental health and education. More precisely, the ways that the institutions of mental health and education play a role and have played a role in our societies at large. These discussions and debates provide us with an opportunity to think critically about what needs to change within these structures for us to live up to our bold slogan, support, protect, and empower each child through youth-focused development, better known as leadership in juvenescence. We recognize that in valuing our children's leadership potential, this also translates as recreating and co-creating environments, both socially and politically, that will enable our children to thrive. For those of you who are particularly keen on the topic, we also write thought pieces every other Monday. We actually have a thought piece that just dropped this past Monday, so definitely be sure to meander over to the website and check out our online content. Now, if it is the case that you are looking for a listening alternative, well, we're available wherever podcasts are playing, and we've provided you with access to a few links down below. Now, as is the convention, be sure to subscribe, hit that post notification bell so that you are aware of every time we post, and of course, if you like these conversations and you want to keep them going, like, comment, and share this segment. Let's get into it. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another segment here on Project Purpose. For those of you who are new, we cover topics that relate to mental health, mental wellness, and education on a week-by-week basis. And today's topic of discussion is mental health. And with the conversation on mental health, I want to talk about the rules that we engage by. And I think that this is really important because a lot of us assume rules that were imposed upon us growing up, whether they are to our detriment or not. And so this has to do with oftentimes the ways that we manage our relationships, the ways that we allow ourselves to be treated within relationships, and the level of investment that we have in relationships that serve us and the relationships that don't. And so I think that this is a really important conversation to have because we're entering holiday season, and so that includes Thanksgiving, that includes Christmas and New Year's, and oftentimes this is when we gather and we make plans to connect with people who we are related to or to people who we are tied to one way or another. And oftentimes it also means, making decisions as to where we put our time, where we place our time, and what those experiences are going to be like. And so for some of you, if you're thinking about the holiday season as a time where you're now starting to really mentally and emotionally prepare yourself for assault, because you know that the people that you're going to be forced to interact with in order to keep the peace are the kinds of people who do not really value that relationship or who find ways to poke and prod at you or to rip you apart. And I'm using language that is fairly, I think, neutral when we think about what some of these experiences have been like. And I remember it took a few years for me into my adult life to think about the traditions that I was maintaining and to think to myself, well, how are these traditions serving me? How is it serving me when it is the case that I spend the majority of my years, the 9 months out of 12, making a point to expose myself to certain individuals in small doses, so really making myself scarce because these relationships were really very toxic, but then mentally and emotionally preparing myself to have to spend physical time with people who I knew just were not good for me. It was in deep reflection in the latter part of my 20s where I realized this isn't a habit, this isn't the tradition that I want to maintain. I don't want to maintain exposing myself to relationships and to dynamics that I know are not going to be healthy, that are not going to be helpful, and that are potentially going to be harmful because it takes a little bit of time to recuperate and to recalibrate from those types of experiences. And I think that oftentimes it is the relationship that we neglect, which is the relationship that we have with ourselves, that make us really easy picking for the relationships that we know don't serve us. Because if we're not approaching relationships with first the lens of honoring the relationship with ourselves, then we're going to allow ourselves to entertain relationships that dishonor us completely. And so I have zero threshold for relationships that dishonor me because my primary relationship that I recognized I needed to build in order to cultivate and to attract healthy relationships with others is the relationship that I have with myself. And so when I started focusing on the relationship that I have with myself throughout the year, not just in specific moments, but as part of my lifestyle, as I started to really build a lifestyle that honored my relationship with myself as part of like the day-to-day, it wasn't an aside or a thought that happened every now and again. It was the way that I drove my life. Then I recognized that I really didn't have room in my life to make space for people who I knew 100% were going to be rude, were going to make me feel uncomfortable, were going to make me feel unworthy. I mean, I just didn't want to make space for these kinds of people in my life. But I think the difficulty there is they're tied to people we care about. And oftentimes it is the people that we care about where we have good enough relationships with that make us feel like, okay, well, you know, I can't cut this one toxic person out without also having it impact this relationship that I actually do value. But I think that we need to think about it when we think about relationships that honor our relationship with ourselves is how are we valuing the relationship with people who value relationships with others who disrespect that relationship with ourselves. And I think that this degree of separation here is something that took me a little bit more time to come to terms with, but I've recognized that I need to also make sure that when I'm creating space in my life for healthy, new, and purposeful relationships, that it also means that I'm making less room for the relationships with those who aren't necessarily toxic, but who allow and who make room and who tolerate the toxic relationships that they themselves have witnessed. And so a lot of the people in my life are not necessarily the people who were actively toxic relationships, but the relationships were people who are passive in witnessing the toxic relationships that I myself was enduring. And so I recognized that though those relationships weren't directly harmful, they weren't directly abusive, it was their passivity that made it difficult for me to make the choices to honor my relationship with myself by cutting out the relationships with those who were dishonoring it, because I recognize that there are different degrees of separation between the kinds of people who dishonor your relationship with yourself. And some of them, they're very active, they're very obviously abusive and very obviously toxic, but others is the passivity, the people who are silent in the face of your abuse. And those are the people who value you well enough to spend time with you, but not value you enough to take a stand and also make it a point to disconnect from people who they see dishonoring you. And I think that this is something that is very difficult for the majority of people to navigate, because it means the large percentages of our circles are going to be impacted. And so a lot of the conflicts that I would have in my circle when I started to really cultivate my voice and take a stand and really create no contact or very little room for interaction with people who are abusive were the people who felt impacted by my choices. They didn't want the dynamic to shift. They wanted to keep the peace or have the relationships with the groups that we were sort of filtering through to be the same. And when they realized that I was not going to budge, or I was not going to be tolerant to abusive behavior, then it impacted their relationship with me. And they wanted me to keep the peace, to kind of take it on the chin so that they could have their cake and eat it too, so that they can maintain relationships with the people who I myself was recognizing that I couldn't have a relationship with these people without it entering into conflict with myself. So I think that if you're experiencing those kinds of relationships, the relationships with people who aren't necessarily abusive, but who are passive in the face of your abuse, or who are silent, who want to keep the peace, who want you to kind of just grin and bear it so that they're not dealing with discomfort themselves, that they want you to be uncomfortable so that they can maintain comfort. I think those are the kinds of relationships that we also need to think critically about maintaining, because if you want to make room for you, if you want to make room for healthy, you want to give yourself the space to build and maintain a healthy relationship with yourself. It also means that you have to create distance from the relationships that are passive or more silent in the face of the abusive relationships that they see you entertaining or they see you trying to create distance with. And so that was a conversation I want to have with you today. I think that it's really very difficult to navigate social relationships when all of us are connected by some way, shape, or form. But I think if you want to shift and change those connections, if you want better for ourselves, if you want higher quality relationships with ourselves, it means making room not just with the obviously abusive, but with those who are passively okay with that, who entertain the idea that it's okay for you to be in situations and relationship with people who hurt you. And so I think when it comes to our mental health, it doesn't just mean making the tough decisions with the easy and obvious people that we recognize aren't good for us. It's also making those tough decisions for the people who could have made a stand, should have made a stand, would have made a stand, but then chose not to. And so I think that that's the conversation I'll have today. It's going to kick off maybe much more specific conversations around maintaining our mental health by way of the relationships that we choose to entertain, and how we can establish relationships with others that honor the relationship that we would like to cultivate and maintain with ourselves. And part of that is just this reflection that we want to do and think about the kinds of people that we entertain, the relationships that we honor and that we value, and to think about, well, is that reciprocated? And is that reciprocated in the way that those people react and respond when they see that I am not being valued or that I'm being dishonored? dishonored and disrespected by the relationships that we entertain collectively, that, you know, the relationships that we have in our collective circle. So that's important food for thought for you. I think it gives you some periphery, because a lot of the times it is those relationships that are caught in between, that are caught on the rift that we're creating between those unhealthy dynamics, that end up needing to be the ones that we have to make those tough calls on, because they're not ready to make those tough calls themselves. So that is what I want to talk about today, some food for thought for you as it relates to my stalking situation. No information for you as yet, but you will be the first to know when I do. But thank you so much again. Hopefully that is helpful to you, and we look forward to chatting with all of you very soon. We'll talk to you later.